In this instance, we got some crazy breaking news that I literally had to jump out of bed to make this video for you guys. So before we get to the content, my podcast Laced Up, featuring Mike Korzemba and Get Like Hoop, we're going to be discussing this topic after. So if you go to the comment section really quickly and ask us any questions pertaining to this topic, I'll be able to pull up your questions during the pod, and you might be able to see some of your questions featured in the pod. Also, we're going to give away a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X to a subscriber that turns on our notifications on that channel when that channel gets to 40,000 subscribers. I know I've been saying this a lot lately. I thought we'd get to 40,000 subscribers a lot quicker than we did, but I guess I kind of miscalculated how long it would take for us to get there, because we're at 24,000 so far. And now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? Today we got some absolutely insane news in regards to Boston Celtics culture and Boston Celtics lore. And before I get to the fact that Danny Ainge is expected to step down as president of basketball operations, before I even get to the fact that Brad Stevens is about to do something that I don't believe I've ever seen in NBA history, and you guys could correct me if I'm wrong, we need to discuss the rise and fall of Danny Ainge. And it's a remarkable rise and fall, because although recency bias is going to point out to the fact that Danny Ainge has failed the Boston Celtics on multiple counts, whether it's a botched Gordon Hayward trade for Miles Turner and Doug McDermott, which he turned down because he wanted Miles Turner and Victor Oladipo, or Miles Turner and TJ Warren, which eventually evolved into Gordon Hayward just leaving for the Charlotte Hornets and the Boston Celtics just getting a second-round pick, or if it's just a complete failure of building a culture and alienation of a player that was supposed to be a franchise cornerstone for your team that ended up stomping on your logo instead, or just missing on multiple draft picks. Now, we gotta give the man his dues, because prior to Danny Ainge, the Boston Celtics were an absolute joke of a franchise. As a matter of fact, the best way I could compare the Boston Celtics to a lesser extent, because they weren't even really making it to the playoffs, is more or less like the Sacramento Kings were over the past decade. They were a team that were trying everything they possibly could to get to relevance, and some of their attempts were absolutely laughable, from trying to bring in a controversial head coach and Rick Pitino to coach the team in the late 90s to a team whose best duo was Antoine Walker and Paul Pierce. Now, luckily for them, they did have Paul Pierce, and this was a guy that actually gave Boston Celtic fans a lot of hope. But it wasn't until 2003 when Danny Ainge came in where the Boston Celtics began to see some changes. Now, the changes weren't immediate. In the first year of his tenure as a Boston Celtic, Danny Ainge traded Antoine Walker, which was considered to be a franchise cornerstone, believe it or not. And after 2006 to 2007, after the second worst record in Boston Celtics history, Danny Ainge finally made his move, acquiring both Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen to form a big three with Paul Pierce, which struck terror in all of our hearts, but at the same time was a very respected big three, considering the fact that these were three players that were at the end of their prime or past their prime. And in Kevin Garnett's case, and bear in mind, still a past his prime Kevin Garnett was still pretty good. His best years were way behind him. He wasn't putting up MVP statistics. Bear in mind that this is a player that was in the NBA for 12 years at this point, really just gunning for one last opportunity to win a championship before he rode off into the sunset. And it worked. You combine that with the fact that he hit on a draft pick trade of Rajon Rondo, which would result in Danny Ainge constructing the greatest Boston Celtics team in over 2 decades. This big three was so dominant that it would result in LeBron James leaving the Cleveland Cavaliers to form his own big three in Miami just so he could beat this big three. And after winning a championship in 2008 and a NBA Finals exit in 2010, there would be some drama that would brew underneath. You see, Ray Allen was having some issues with the Boston Celtics. Now, whether those issues were with head coach Doc Rivers, or if they were with Danny Ainge in of itself is a different story altogether, because Ray Allen comes out and says that he left as a free agent because there were so many unresolved issues that the team wasn't considering or willing to change. I know the most notorious of this issue is the fact that Ray Allen was seeing less playing time and was being less of a factor in the Boston Celtics offense, and they wanted him to take a bit of a pay cut, but he took an even greater pay cut to join the Miami Heat and come off of their bench. Now, as a result, whenever the 2008 Boston Celtics have these like commemorative little reunions, you don't really see Ray Allen invited to them as much. But that's a different story for a different day, because what would happen next after the Boston Celtics Big Three's title window would be shut, Danny Ainge would turn around and trade Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and Jason Terry to the Brooklyn Nets for 3 first-round picks, a pick swap, and a cap filler. And the results, although this was seen as a complete pillaging of the worst team in the NBA, were very lukewarm to say the least. Because Danny Ainge would begin a cascade of missing on some draft picks in the form of James Young, hitting on a draft pick in the form of Jaylen Brown, and then completely manipulating the 2017 NBA draft by faking his interest in Markelle Fultz, trading back with the Philadelphia 76ers to the number 3 pick, knowing that the Lakers will probably take Lonzo Ball at the number 2 pick, and then selecting the best player out of the top 5 in Jason Tatum. Through it all, Danny Ainge was somehow able to prolong this Boston Celtics playoff run and have this team rebuild while they were also reloading, something that I don't believe I've ever seen before prior to Danny Ainge doing what he did. But with every good, there was bad. Danny Ainge pulled off an extremely shrewd trade with the Phoenix Suns, acquiring Isaiah Thomas, who was a player that was more or less the Phoenix Suns' 6th man. Brad Stevens was able to focus on Isaiah Thomas in the 2017 season, and as a result, Isaiah Thomas had one of his best seasons, if not the best season of his entire career. He had an identity with the Boston Celtics, and Celtics fans loved him, and he loved Boston back, as this was a team that finally gave him the best opportunity to showcase his skills. And right when things got bad for Isaiah Thomas, when his sister died due to a tragic car accident, and when he had a hip injury during the NBA playoffs, Isaiah Thomas heroically carried the Boston Celtics to multiple wins and multiple heroic playoff performances, including a 53-point game against the Washington Wizards in Game 2 of the Eastern Conference semifinals to get the Boston Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals against the Cleveland Cavaliers, which, after going down 0-2 and not being nearly as much of a factor, and after his hip started acting up, he had to sit out for the remainder of the run, and the Celtics would eventually lose. And the way he was rewarded that offseason is something that would haunt Danny Ainge for the rest of his general manager career. You see, I understand that business is business, and I understand that there's multiple ways of operating. You see, Danny Ainge was a very cutthroat individual, and business is business, and I understand you have to do whatever it takes to build up your team. So he traded Isaiah Thomas along with his final draft pick from the Brooklyn Nets trade in 2013 and Jay Crowder for Kyrie Irving, a player that was supposed to be the Boston Celtics' next franchise cornerstone. And while whether Isaiah Thomas would have fizzled out if he stayed in Boston is a completely separate conversation, the one thing we could agree upon is this gave Danny Ainge a reputation that he will screw over his own players if a better opportunity presented himself, which is ironic because my own personal theory is this might be a reason why Kyrie Irving eventually ended up leaving. As a man that actually values loyalty, it was kind of ironic that Danny Ainge traded for Kyrie Irving because it was an extremely unloyal move for a player that values loyalty. But what would make this even more sad is, as a result, Isaiah Thomas would go to the Cleveland Cavaliers, be rushed back from an injury, look like a shell of his former self, get traded a handful of games later to the Lakers, and in just 1 year, a man that would have gotten paid a maximum contract began getting veteran minimum offers from teams in free agency. Now, obviously, this isn't all Danny Ainge's fault. In hindsight, I think Isaiah Thomas should have just sat out for the entire year. And I'm not criticizing Danny Ainge for this decision. Rather, I'm telling you how this affected the perception of him in the NBA. You see, when you have a general manager like Sam Presti that is devoted to getting his players into good situations, and you compare that to a general manager like Danny Ainge, well, most people aren't going to like Danny Ainge anymore. It's an old school way of doing things, but the way Sam Presti handled his rebuild results in significantly more player trust in Sam Presti, which results in more players wanting to play for him. For example, when he was approached in the summer of 2019 with a trade request from Paul George, yes, he did trade Paul George to the Los Angeles Clippers, and yes, he did gut out the Los Angeles Clippers as a result, getting 5 first-round picks and 2 first-round pick swaps from them. But he sent Paul George to a team that he wants to play for. When Russell Westbrook wanted to be traded as well, he asked Russ where he wanted to play, and Russ said he wanted to play with James Harden on the Houston Rockets, so he got traded for Chris Paul, which was considered to be the lesser player in that entire trade, but needless to say, Sam Presti still did it. He then took Chris Paul, built up his value for a year, and then traded Chris Paul to the Phoenix Suns, a place where he could contend. Now, I'm really interested to see what he's going to do with Al Horford as a result of this, but you guys understand what I'm saying here. And meanwhile, yeah, he is stockpiling an obscene amount of first-round picks, but when you compare his methodology to Danny Ainge, you can see why more people would trust Sam Presti over Danny Ainge, which is why I believe this move was in Danny Ainge's best interest, because Danny Ainge officially stepped down as president of basketball operations for the Boston Celtics. Now, this is where it gets crazy. Brad Stevens is expected to assume a more prominent front office role with the team. So I don't think this has ever been done before, because we've seen head coaches like Doc Rivers or Stan Van Gundy with the Detroit Pistons, Doc Rivers with the Los Angeles Clippers, Tom Thibodeau with the Minnesota Timberwolves do a dual general manager and head coaching role, and usually those situations blow up in their face. But in this instance, you have the head coach of a team saying, I'm no longer going to be the head coach. I'd rather build the team and be the general manager of the team, and the existing general manager deciding to leave. Now, Danny Ainge has been contemplating leaving this job for several months, and he's been talking about possible succession plans with ownership. Stevens turns out to be the franchise's choice, which works out because Danny Ainge actually moved from head coaching in the NBA to the front office with Phoenix. Brad Stevens apparently was worn down with coaching since the NBA bubble and wanted to make the transition to the front office. There is going to be a formal announcement coming later on today, maybe by the time this video is out. Currently, the top 2 choices for head coach for the Boston Celtics are Jason Kidd, the assistant coach of the Los Angeles Lakers, and Lloyd Pierce, the old Atlanta Hawks coach that got fired earlier this year. Danny Ainge wasn't a bad general manager by any means. He wasn't a remarkable general manager, but he was better than most general managers in my opinion. There were some risks he took that just didn't pan out, like the Kyrie Irving trade. I understand why he took that risk. It just didn't pan out for him. Not trading for Miles Turner was yet another risk, and Gordon Hayward ended up leaving for nothing as a result. There are multiple times in the NBA where you make a move that is logical, that should work, and it just doesn't. And in Danny Ainge's case, there were times where it did work out, and there were times where it just didn't. But at least he was able to pull the Boston Celtics out of the depths of mediocrity. But for now, at least in this instance, after the Boston Celtics failed to surround Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown with any substantial star players outside of Kemba Walker, and the jury is out on him, it makes a lot of sense why they would decide to make this move. A new approach is absolutely necessary for this case, especially considering that players probably don't trust Danny Ainge anymore. So let me know if you're a Boston Celtic fan what you think about this move. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.